Caros alunos do Direito Financeiro, é uma grande satisfação dar início a este evento internacional, que é uma aula aberta da disciplina de pós-graduação Perspectivas do Orçamento para o Século XXI e uma atividade do grupo de pesquisas sobre orçamentos públicos. Estamos recebendo hoje o professor Christoph Herrmann, da Universidade de Passau, que falará sobre o tema International Monetary Law and Monetary Unions, Some Fundamentals. Muito obrigado por essa valiosa colaboração à nossa universidade, professor. É uma grande honra recebê-lo. E eu, depois de fazer a saudação também em inglês, vou passar a condução aos trabalhos ao professor Gabriel. Dear students of Public Financial Law, it's a great pleasure to start this international event, which is an open class of the postgraduate course Budget Perspectives for the 21st Century, and an activity of the research group on public budgets. Today, we are receiving Professor Christoph Herrmann from the University of Passau, who will speak on the theme International Monetary Law and Monetary Unions, Some Fundamentals. Thank you very much, Professor, for this valuable contribution for our university. It's a great honor to welcome you. I now hand over the work to Professor Gabriel Lochagin, who allowed this contact. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Professor Conti. It's a pleasure to have Professor Christoph Herrmann here with us. Professor Herrmann is a great specialist and a very well-known authority on international trade and international finance, with many contributions to this field, both in the academy and also with his practical works. And we are very honored to have the opportunity to listen to him today in our post-graduation course. Our LLM students and also PhD students are very glad to have the opportunity to learn with you about monetary unions, a very interesting topic, a very hot topic on public finances and also international economy. And also, as a whole, the general audience who are following us through our YouTube channel, well, we're very modern in this area. We transmit our courses in classrooms. And Professor Herrmann, just listen to Professor Horvath and Andressa, who are here with us. I think they also want to say a few words before you start, and then you have the floor. After you finish your presentation, I'll see if our students have questions to make to you. And if they do, in case they present them in English, of course, you will understand them. But in case they're in Portuguese, we can translate them to you. Thank you very much again. Professor Horvath.
Good morning, Professor Herrmann. It's a pleasure to have you here. And we welcome with all the honors that our university can give you. Thank you very much. Thank
you. Dear Professor Herrmann, I just want to reinforce the words of Professor Conte, Professor Lochagin, Professor Esteban Horvath, to thank you to be here with us today, sharing your knowledge. I'm looking forward to hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand that the floor is mine now, right?
Yes, please, Professor Herrmann.
It's good morning to Brazil. In Germany, it's now early afternoon, so shortly after lunch, and I hope I won't fall asleep. Can you see my slides now? I have enacted the slide sharing, and is that working or?
Yes, we can follow.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now we check whether clicking does also work. No. Yeah, clicking is also working. Okay. The pleasure and honor is, of course, entirely mine, and I beg for your pardon that I'm not able to address you in Portuguese. I've had some training in French, Spanish, and Italian in my life, but unfortunately not in Portuguese. But I hope English will do. And for the subject monetary sovereignty, given the role and importance of, on the one hand, the International Monetary Fund based in Washington, D.C., and the United States of America and its US dollar, English is probably the right language anyway to address a topic of that kind. So what is monetary sovereignty to begin with? As public international lawyers, of course, we always try to address things from the sovereignty perspective, because this is a good starting point when you want to consider afterwards what you can govern by means of, for example, international agreements. So we have, as a starting point in public international law, we have the general principle of the sovereignty of states. And with regard to money, this includes two aspects. The internal one, which means states are sovereign to govern their internal economical, societal, political affairs, and that includes parts of regulating money. And of course, externally, we have the dimension that we may prevent interference from other forces, other actors, other states, and the like. And monetary sovereignty is broadly and widely considered to be the power of a state to issue and regulate money within its own territory. So we come to the problem from the territorial perspective. So whatever is within our territory can be governed by the state, and this includes the use, for example, of a specific currency within that very territory. The term what monetary sovereignty exactly comprises of is not legally defined. So we don't find anywhere an international legal agreement saying monetary sovereignty comprises of or embraces, contains, etc., etc. But it has been recognized as early as almost 100 years ago by the Permanent Court of International Justice in the Serbian loans case, that it is generally accepted that a state is entitled to regulate its own currency. What does that include? Because only within considering what is included, we can then move on to what parts of sovereignty we may be willing to give in, for example, within a currency union. So, if we accept that monetary sovereignty is something that resides with the state, and of course there is people who still believe, and Friedrich August von Hayek was one of them, that money should all be private, and that there should be private currencies issued by private banks, regulated just by a private contract. But we don't go that far, I think, and there is no, even with the bitcoins and all these sorts of e-tokens, e-token money, we don't really have seen any working private currency so far. So if we accept that monetary sovereignty resides with the state, so it's for the state to determine, the question is what to determine. First of all, the power to issue currency. This has not always been the kind of natural prerogative of a state, but when money kind of made its way from mere tradable goods such as cows, all sorts of precious metals, etc., etc. So when the sort of the time of coinage began, it was the states that used their prerogatives and tried to catch the monopoly for coinage, and thereby issuing coins, which were then subsequently made legal tender and made the main currency of a given territory. So it includes the power to issue a currency. So country A is saying, we want to have a currency, and this is named the A dollar. And we will print banknotes, etc., etc. So we set up a currency and we give it a name and we issue this currency. Furthermore, it includes then all what is necessary to regulate money. For example, set up a central banking system, provide for legal tender status of what is being issued, provide for what is called the recurrent nexus to a currency that has been there before, maybe. For example, if you introduce a new currency in a currency reform, you need to govern the exchange rate between the old debt, which still exists. Let's imagine someone having employment, someone having a rental agreement, etc., etc., and that states that a certain sum of money needs to be paid on a regular basis. And if you now make a currency reform, you introduce a new currency, you must put in legal writing somewhere what the exchange is between the old currency and the new one. That is, for example, something we very often see in high inflation countries, for example, in Central Africa. If inflation is so high that the digits on the coins and banknotes become too long, then a currency reform may include just cutting off 6 zeros or something, or 9 zeros, depending on how high inflation has been. That's all sorts of regulating money, including, for example, also the potential of private banks to create bank money. Then to formulate and control the monetary policy. So how shall we govern the supply of money in the economy? Do we want to expand the monetary basis over time? Do we want to have a fixed exchange rate to other states? Do we want to have a backing with a foreign currency or with some sort of asset, reserve assets such as gold? So there's many different decisions the state can make in order to control the monetary policy. And at least in the industrialized countries nowadays, G7, G20, etc., this is normally then delegated to an independent or more or less independent central bank to formulate the monetary policy. What is the objective? What are the instruments being used, etc.? All this is part of the monetary sovereignty residing with the state. Impose currency and capital controls. When we think, or when we see that there is roughly 200 states in the world, and every state is making use of its own monetary sovereignty, there will be 200 different currencies. And of course, given the principle of territoriality, every state can impose, in principle, controls when it comes to money leaving or entering the country. You may impose an obligation to exchange into your own currency for foreign currencies that come into your country. You may impose other forms of limitations on the amount of money that can be imported, the amount of money that can be exported, so brought away, etc. So all these sorts of, even in the European Union, we still have that kind of controls. If you carry more than 10,000 euro with you, you are under an obligation to notify that when you cross into the European Union, for example. That's not a restriction, but it is at least it's a notification obligation, and it's meant to combat tax withholding and money laundering, of course. And as with sovereignty in general, states must recognize the monetary legal acts of other states. This was something that was researched a lot when the European Union moved towards the euro area. So when the euro was introduced as a new legal tender in the participating member states of the European Union, there were huge legal briefs written on whether, for example, courts in the United States had to accept this changeover to another currency, which is basically a currency reform, and what to do with legal obligations of the member states whose currencies were basically abolished or replaced by the euro, such as the French franc, Deutschmark, etc., etc. So, and there the principle is that when the state has voluntarily exercised its monetary sovereignty, has had a currency reform or a debasement or whatever, this is to be accepted by other states, in particular, of course, the courts, because it's hard to see that this would play a role for other institutions within a state than typically courts, before which a case could be brought, making a claim on the basis of a government bond, for example, that was issued 10 years ago before the currency reform and must now be paid, of course, in the new currency. So that's basically our starting point, that we can, what we can do. What we then also have seen over the past years and also over the past decades and centuries is what is called currency wars. a currency war is not legally a war in the public international sense, and it's not an act of aggression under the United Nations Charter. It's rather what we, in comparison with trade wars, for example, it's a bit of breaking the rules, not complying maybe with all the obligations you have, in particular under the IMF Articles of Agreement, through, in particular, manipulating your exchange rate, the value of your own currency as a state vis-a-vis other currencies. This is not unlimitless possible, but in particular, if your currency is under an upward pressure where the value of your currency is increasing vis-a-vis other currencies, you can basically prevent that from happening by buying foreign currencies against your own currency in order to keep the exchange rate low. And this is what in particular, the Chinese central bank and the government have been doing and been engaging in for quite some time in order to control the exchange rate of the yuan or renminbi, the Chinese currency, so that it doesn't increase in value against the US dollar in particular too quickly. And thereby secure export success, because of course by doing that you can also control the export value of your goods, make them cheaper, and that's why in the United States many people or many politicians consider that to be currency dumping, what the Chinese government has been engaging in here. So you either have what is called a so-called inflexible peg. So you peg your currency against another currency at a kind of fixed exchange rate, and if you have upward pressure to evaluate your currency, you're just not following it. If you have downward pressure, you won't be able to contain that for a long time, because then you would need to sell foreign reserves and buy your own currency. And that it's typically the situation where a balance of payment crisis then occurs at some point. And a currency with a downward, a devaluation, under devaluation pressure cannot be saved through buying it against international currencies on the markets, because the international financial markets are just stronger, and they will finally beat the central bank of a country that is trying to defend an unsustainable currency peg. But if you have upward pressure, that's no problem, because you're basically only selling your own currency, and you're accumulating huge foreign currency reserves, such as in the case of China. They accumulated something like $3 trillion worth in reserves over a certain period of time, investing that again in US government bonds, and thereby becoming the largest creditor to the US government, which makes all this sort of the big G2 conflict somewhat complicated, because the two countries are so interdependent in many ways. But we can only hope that this is a real obstacle to war or whatever may be on the horizon. Okay, quantitative easing means that you have a monetary policy where you try to broaden the monetary base. You make it easier for banks to lend from the central bank. You lower the interest rates, and all this is being done in order to support the economic development within your country. That has been taking place, in particular in the traditional industrialized countries, in the US, in Japan, in the Euro area, in response to the global economic crisis of 2007 and ongoing, and the COVID pandemic. But at a certain point, it's possibly not working anymore, and there has been arguments that this is in a similar way as an undervalued currency, a way of fighting a currency war. And in particular for the United States, this argument has some truth in it, due to the role that the US dollar plays on international financial markets. So as the US finance minister once said, it's our currency, but your problem. So the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve in New York, this is having impact around the globe through the role of the US dollar. So monetary sovereignty under erosion, or is there an erosion of monetary sovereignty? Absolute monetary sovereignty is certainly nothing which can be achieved nowadays anymore, because you would need to uncut your economy from the influence of global financial markets, other countries, and basically be autonomous in your supply of most things, because otherwise you will always see the transmission of economic unrest in other economies into your own economic system and currency. As state's monetary sovereignty may be surrendered, for example, such as to the European Monetary Union or to the European Union in the component of EMU. But this can also be seen as a kind of pooling of sovereignty, as a cooperative use of sovereignty. And in particular, in the European Union, we understand the EU as a project to basically ensure that we still be able to influence things in the world, including international financial system, as the individual countries or the individual currencies, maybe with the exception of the Deutschmark, were not sort of powerful enough to participate in the effective governance of the international monetary system. There's also some institutional limitations by the International Monetary Fund and some limitations to what we may do, in particular as regards the manipulation of the exchange rate. But the problem with the International Monetary Fund is that it is an international law agreement, which is in principle binding, but there is no real effective sort of dispute settlement or kind of punishment mechanism when you don't stick to the rules. In theory, there are mechanisms, but these mechanisms are not effective with a view to countries, for example, the People's Republic of China. When you think of a perceived exchange rate manipulation, because one of the central sanctions, for example, would be to reject or to deny the country in breach of the statute of the IMF access to IMF funding. IMF funding is extremely relevant and important for developing economies that face balance of payment crises, such as Mexico, Turkey, Argentina, etc. But it's totally irrelevant for a country that has $3 trillion in foreign currency reserves. That there we rather see the IMF asking China for liquidity, international liquidity, than the other way around. Okay, so there is no effective sanctioning in the system, which means that the effectiveness of the legal rules is also limited here. So we still can do a lot, but absolute sovereignty, in the sense political scientists often use the notion, does not exist. It does not exist because even though if you can regulate money, you cannot control the mood and the behavior of international financial markets. If international financial markets lose trust in your currency, that is nothing which you can sort of react to legally. You have to react to that by making policy changes, maybe to win back the trust of international financial markets, etc., etc. But that's basically beyond your powers to effectively control that. Also, a lesson hard to learn sometimes for governments which pursue certain domestic economic policies in order to win the next general elections, but then face a loss of trust in international financial markets, and the inflation goes up, the exchange rate of the currency against international currencies goes down, and the whole economy gets on a slippery slope. How has the international legal system? So now we have seen that basically what can be done. States can regulate a lot, even if it's not absolute, and they still must rely and are dependent on international financial markets. How has the international legal system now evolved against this backdrop? Basically, before 1944, there was no real international obligations on money, at least no multilateral. Of course, there were bilateral agreements, currency unions, for example, between Switzerland and Liechtenstein that existed long time before that. But internationally, there was no real substance in international agreements. Under the gold standard, or under metallist currency standards, basically, the rules were made by the facts of the precious metal. So the exchange rate, for example, between different currencies was directly governed by the content of gold or silver in the respective currency, as provided for by the respective monetary law. For example, Germany was until 1914 was a gold-backed currency that was established. The Deutsche Reichsmark at that time, when the unification of Germany in the 19th century had taken place, then a central bank was set up. All the private note banks which existed at that time were basically closed down within a matter of 30 years. And the Deutsche Reichsmark was backed with gold. It was basically a gold mark. And if you have that, then you know that a certain amount of gold is in one of these coins, and you have a direct exchange rate to another currency which also has a gold content, by just matching the weight of the different coins. I don't know. Do you? Okay, you can still see the slides. Okay, so around 1870. Gold was the generally accepted basis for currencies and for international payments. And so if you had different inflation tracks basically in countries, or different interest rates, then gold would relatively quickly have moved between these countries in order to reap the higher interest rates in other countries. So one could say that under the gold standard, there was a kind of international monetary union based on gold, because there was the common backing, the common external anchor for all the currencies that used the gold standard. Why is it not continuing? Click. Okay, so now it. With the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, the IMF Articles of Agreement, or the Fund Agreement as it is called, gold was made the basis, the backing for an international monetary system, where the US dollar was pegged against the value of gold at that time, and all other currencies either had to fix against gold or to fix against the US dollar. So what the IMF Articles of Agreement established was a kind of international gold standard for all countries participating. That is in so far interesting, and that before World War II, after World War I, the reintroduction of the gold standard had failed. Why had the gold standard to be reintroduced? Well, for example, Germany, when World War I began in 1914, immediately ended the obligation to exchange gold against Reichsbank banknotes. So in these gold standard systems at that time, you had a central bank which was sitting on more or less huge gold reserves, was under an obligation to exchange money into gold at a certain fixed rate. And then what you saw circulating in the economy was either banknotes by the central bank, private banknotes to the extent that this still existed, or other forms of IOUs, such as state money, so like basically transferable bonds without not bearing interest rates, which could be used to pay taxes. You may have had token money based on other metals which had no innate value. But it was all backed by the possibility to exchange whenever you please to do your money into real gold. And when World War I began, Germany and other countries immediately cut off this obligation to exchange money into gold, because gold was then needed for international trade transactions to finance the war, etc., etc. So what we saw over the course of World War I in Europe was inflation, of course. And after World War I, the United Kingdom tried to get back to the old gold standard and re-established basically the value of the pound sterling on the basis of the same amount of gold as before the war. But due to the inflation that had taken place, this was far too high a value for the British pound. So what the British experienced was a strict deflation with an economic crisis. So it was not really sustainable. And after World War II, the United States basically were the only who were powerful enough to back the whole system. And even that didn't really work out. I jumped why the gold standard failed on the basis of reparations imposed on Germany after World War I. One of the one side note here. One of the effects of this interwar time was the establishment of the Bank for International Settlements. That was used originally to handle German reparations, which had to be paid to the Allies, to the United States, to Great Britain, and to France after World War I. And you needed some sort of international transaction bank for that. Now the Bank for International Settlements is described as the central bank of central banks. So we still have that, but of course with the different tasks than at the time when it was established. So, and then in the interwar time with the global economic crisis after 1929, and then with the Second World War, of course, the whole system collapsed. In 1944, the IMF was established. And I need to check the watch so that I don't know exactly, Gabriel, what did you say? How much time do I have? 2 days? No.
Could have even 3, but I think 1 hour and a half will be fine, or 1 hour, 1 hour and a half.
Okay, so then we still have some time for questions afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, we have the saying that German professors can talk about every given topic for 90 minutes without break. But we want to maybe engage in the discussion also. So the IMF was needed to establish international trade again, because trade is always based on the possibility to also make payments, cross-border payments. Cross-border trade is relying on the possibility of making cross-border payments, which is why in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, for example, you also find provisions on balance of payments problems and how this relates to your obligations under the GATT. So the object of the IMF was to foster cooperation and reconstruction after World War II, to avoid basically the mistakes that had been made after World War I in terms of economic policy, to establish and to uphold an open and non-discriminatory international monetary system in which basically all participating states would be under an obligation to strive for convertibility of their currencies so that currencies could freely go back and forth, and of course provide monetary stability through stable exchange rates with the overall backing by gold. The problem which then occurred, and the problem of the whole so-called par value system of the IMF, that became more and more visible by the end of the 1960s, is a very fundamental problem associated with every currency system which is backed by any sort of exogenous means of payment or reserve assets such as gold. The amount of gold which is available is not strictly limited, because gold is found and exploited and taken out of the soil on a daily basis, but still we have no control over the expansion, the amount of gold which is available globally. It depends on exploitation. It depends on whether it is being used for non-monetary purposes, for example. So we have with the gold system, you have a basis for your monetary system, which cannot effectively be controlled. And if you want to have a stable currency, stable in the sense that the price levels remain more or less the same or only slowly develop in one direction, ideally slowly inflating by a low percentage rate by year, and reflecting, for example, technological advancements, and offering the possibility for reallocation and reassessment of the different factors in the economy. If you want to have that, you need to control the monetary basis to allow for this expansion. If your monetary base is fixed, a fixed amount of gold, then the more the economy expands, the more deflation you must see. Because if the monetary basis remains the same, but the economy gets larger, then money is actually evaluating. So the value of money is increasing, and this against a basket of goods would be called a deflation. So for a given amount of money, of gold, you would be able to buy more next year and the year thereafter and the year thereafter, which basically means that people would withhold their consumption and wait for this deflation to happen. That's maybe something, I don't know whether this is also the case in Brazil, but in Europe, for example, we see that with regard to laptop computers and mobile phones very often, not because of general deflation, but because of a particular deflation for these items due to technological advancements. So you know that very often over time, laptop computers become either cheaper or become more powerful in terms of what they can do. So for a student, for example, in Germany, the question always is, do I already need a laptop computer, or can I wait, for example, until the next term break when I need to write some sort of seminar thesis or whatever? Because then I will get a better model for the same money, or I will have to pay less. And that's withholding consumption. So in a system which is exclusively based on an exogenous, non-controllable reserve asset such as gold, you will possibly see deflation, general broad deflation, due to this particular effect that you cannot expand the monetary base. So why is this relevant for the fate of the IMF? Well, the IMF was based on a stable currency backing, but in times of industrialization. Well, the argument of proponents of a gold-backed currency, for example, is very often that over centuries you had stable prices for everything, given that you had gold as the central means of payment. But of course, until industrialization began, we have seen no huge jumps in productivity, and not such an expansion of economic activity as after industrialization began. So during the medieval times, of course, you could have stable prices, but you also had a stable economy in the sense that there was no economic growth except for growth due to a growth in the population. You had practically no productivity growth except for some jumps sometimes when, for example, agriculture innovated a little, and then it was easier to produce, and then you had more products, and this was a bit of an expansion in terms of what the economy could provide. But that's, of course, nothing compared to what happened in the 18th and the 19th century, and what is still happening with digitalization, etc. So we see a huge expansion of economic activity. And in order for that not to lead to deflationary pressure on the currency, you need to have a flexible monetary basis, a basis which can be controlled, but of course it must not be abused. And that's the reason why we have arrived in the Western Hemisphere, in industrialized countries, at a situation where we have independent central banks tasked to preserve price stability by controlling the monetary basis and the monetary transmission mechanism. That's basically the arrangement. So but this was a lesson hard to learn, basically, for the international monetary system first. In the 1960s were the time when the policies of John Maynard Keynes became very popular, pushing a stagflating or a non-growing economy. Maybe due to that, during the Second World War, there had been massive war production, of course. After the Second World War, there has been massive reallocation of resources to the production of consumer goods in Europe, to rebuilding all the destroyed infrastructure, etc., etc. And at a certain point in Germany, around the late 1950s, in other countries maybe at different points in time, we saw that this sort of economic boost ended. Okay, because this is always a kind of catching up situation with huge economic growth, and this came to an end. And with this coming to an end, and with all the productivity gains, all of a sudden we saw unemployment of a scale we didn't know before. And the theories of John Maynard Keynes were that in this situation where you have a negative sort of balanced economy at a certain unemployment rate, and with low and slow growth, it would be for the state to finance growth, to hand out money, for example, invest in infrastructure, etc., and lend this money from financial markets. So basically, debt-based growth. That was the idea. The problem is, if you do that, you also create inflation sometimes, and you expand the economy in a way that cannot be longer reflected by the gold basis of the currency. So, in particular, the United States were in the situation that they could not uphold their promise to exchange US dollars always in gold, because the monetary basis in the US just expanded too much. There was not enough gold, in theory, to exchange it or to hand it out against the US dollar in case that someone called the bluff, basically. So that's why in 1971, 15th of August, the United States ended their promise to exchange US dollar in gold. So the first period of the IMF, this reconstruction and cooperation time, ended there, and with 1971 the par value system ended, and we entered into the age of flexible and floating exchange rates. This took about a decade, during which in Europe, for example, we set up something similar like the IMF, the European Monetary System, EMS, with fixed exchange and packed exchange rates. And then in 1981, basically, the free floating of currency was also formally legalized in the Bretton Woods system in the IMF Articles of Agreement through an amendment to the articles. And ever since then, member states of the IMF have no real hard obligation with a view to exchange rates anymore, as compared to the pact system before, except that they must not engage in currency manipulation. The 1980s were a decade of large debt crisis and reforms in the IMF, with the Latin American crisis, and then with the fall of the Iron Curtain, of course, everything changed, and the whole international legal environment and economic environment changed. So the role of the IMF became more in 1990 to contribute to societal changes and the transformation of the economies of the former Soviet bloc to market economies. So it was focusing a lot of its attention on Eastern Europe and also on Asia, and all the catch-up that was then following China's decision in 1978-79 to move to market economy reforms under Deng Xiaoping and enter basically global markets in a meaningful way. And until today, basically ever since around 2004, and of course you may always argue the exact years, we are in the phases of crisis management and dealing with the increased role, in particular of China, China's demands to have a greater say in the IMF that more reflects its economic heavyweight, and of course all the management of debt crisis, balance of payment crisis, currency crisis, the euro crisis, the global economic crisis, the COVID crisis. So crisis is a word of the last 15 years, one might say, with regard to the international economy. And that's what the IMF is confronted with currently. So we have with the IMF an international legal framework governing the use of monetary sovereignty, but only in a very limited way. Originally, as I said, we had this backing by gold and the US dollar with a fixed gold value for every individual currency. And for countries that had achieved full convertibility, the possibility to exchange that freely, back and forth. Okay, so you had, in order to be a fully qualified member of the IMF, so to speak, you had to reach full convertibility, so that there was no balance of payments restrictions in place anymore, no restrictions on the exchange of your currency. That is, for example, something which China hasn't arrived and achieved by today, because there is still huge limits on the export of Chinese currency, or generally of money out of the People's Republic of China. So they basically exercise an export investment control system, which is just looking into sums of money, etc., and the whole reserves of the Chinese central bank and the Chinese investment fund, etc. That's where the surplus from the fixed currency basically ends up. So we have no free convertibility. That was the system until 71. I think we can jump these slides a bit quicker in order to move forward to the okay. So what are the legal problems then now with the exercise of monetary sovereignty? First of all, we have a problem we are confronted with, which is the lack of a universal currency. So whenever two parties engage in a trade transaction across borders, they need to arrange and agree on how to handle the payment. Okay, so you have two parties, country A, country B, or located in country A and country B, and they need to discuss, are we going to, or who is, let's say B is a buyer of something, in which currency are you going to pay me? How do we get you to get the money to my bank account in my country? What is the exchange rate between your currency and mine? How do we make, for example, safeguards for a change in the exchange rate in between our trade transaction? Imagine that I'm maybe buying a power station, which you are meant to build in my country over the time of the next 5 years. There may be lots of currency exchange rate changes during these 5 years. And we need, and then we have two jurisdictions which are affected by this transaction, right? We have the one where the power station is ordered and needs to be paid. This must allow for payments being made into the other country, maybe payments to be exchanged into the other currency. And the same is true for the country from which the power station comes. It must allow for the inflow of foreign currency, or it must allow for, of course, the export of the power station, but this is not a monetary law problem. And it must allow for the exchange of these two currencies at a certain rate. And the strangest situation would happen where you have two countries, both with a fixed exchange rate, but at a different rate against the dollar, so they don't really match, and where both legal systems control the inflow and outflow of money. That can make trade almost impossible. Which is why, besides the free movement of goods rules we have in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the prohibition on quantitative restrictions, we basically, under a convertibility, do also have a prohibition on the exchange of currency. So first, we have all these different currencies. We have no international currency or vehicle currency, which is sort of globally universally accepted. The only thing we have, at least not legally, the only thing we now have is a de facto universal currencies, and that is very much the US dollar. If you were asked to you win around the world plane ticket, and you may have as many stops as you please, and you get an allowance to sustain your lifestyle during your travel around the world, and you were asked in which currency do you want that, I would guess that the most likely answers by something like 95% of people in the world would be in US dollars, please, because that is a currency where you have the greatest likelihood that you can really make payments and exchange that anywhere in the world. Okay, the Swiss franc is certainly also good. The euro is good. The Japanese yen is also good, and increasingly the Chinese yuan. But you would certainly not ask for the currency of Burundi or Colombia or whatever currency, you name it. Like, there is some currencies which are widely recognized internationally, but not in the sense that you can make payments in a small shop on the high street, but that it is easy to get them exchanged in currencies in a bank anywhere in the world, almost anywhere. North Korea may still be a problem, as may be Iran. And some other countries, but in the countries which are more or less open to the world, the US dollar should normally take you some way. So it's currencies which are predominant in international trade, a major, basically backed by the economic power of the country in which they are legal tender. Because if you hold US dollars, you know that you can always buy stuff in the United States with that. And given the economic power the United States still have, this is quite a good backing. And the same is true for the euro. It's a legal tender in 19 member states of the European Union, including Germany, France, Italy. So you can be pretty sure that there is some value to it if you are able to buy things in shops, etc., on streets with it. And basically the trust in the purchasing power of a given currency is what makes the currency powerful and what has the capacity of making it a de facto international currency. And that is something the Chinese government is working on heavily, to make the Chinese yuan an international currency by agreeing, for example, with foreign governments that bilateral trade is not being paid for in US dollars anymore, but in Chinese yuan. So, for example, the Chinese government recently agreed with, I think, Saudi Arabia on paying for crude oil in Chinese yuan instead of US dollar, and making itself more independent from the US dollar, and thereby also diminishing the global role the US dollar has. And there is economists that argue that the role of the dollar may indeed come to an end in the foreseeable future, which means more or less one generation or so. And other international currencies may take the role. It's certainly not the Chinese yuan internationally, due to the limits on convertibility, because holding Chinese yuan is still a bit of a problem, because you cannot use it as freely as other currencies. But it is definitely becoming more powerful. You need to have a relatively stable value for your currency, otherwise nobody will trust it. It needs to be convertible, and you need a stable political background in the issuing state. And that is something against which you must read all the discussions which you now have again about the debt brake in the United States, and the possibility that the United States may default on its sovereign bonds if the US Congress doesn't increase the debt level, the debt ceiling for the US government. That would send a huge blow to the trust in the political backing and the monetary system and the fiscal capacity of the United States, and that would not be good for the global role of the US dollar. And liberalized financial markets in the issuing state. So that is one of the. So if you check these and then check against China, you see we have no full convertibility for China for the yuan. We have a stable political background. That much we can say. Whether it is a favorable one is another question, but we don't have liberalized financial markets in the issuing state. For example, you cannot invest freely in Chinese banks. There is still a joint venture obligation. There is limits to the amount of capital you may hold in financial institutions in the People's Republic of China, etc. And there is also questions about the stability of the Chinese banking system due to the real estate price bubble. They have been blowing up over the past decade. Reserve currencies, in comparison to these de facto international currencies, are currencies which are held by central banks in order to pay off international debt. Normally, if states want to lend on the international financial markets, they will lend in reserve currencies, in de facto international currencies such as the US dollar, the British pound sterling, the Japanese yen, the euro, or the Swiss franc. And if you lend in these currencies, you must also pay off your debt in these currencies, of course, which means the government will get a loan, let's say 10 billion US dollar, will convert that into its own currency, spend it in its own jurisdiction in order to pay civil servants, to invest in infrastructure, whatever. So the money will go into the central bank, and the central bank will then use that as a reserve for exchange transactions of the private economy as well. So in case you're running a trade surplus, then there will be an additional inflow of international currencies, of reserve currencies, because these international transactions will normally be paid in de facto international currencies. So if you have a trade surplus, your foreign exchange reserves will normally be growing, except for a situation where your undertakings engage in foreign investment and invest these currencies directly again in third countries, which is the reason why, for example, Germany, which used to be the export champion of the world for many, many decades, until the Chinese took over just by sheer size, was not only the trade export world champion of the world, but also the world champion in capital exports. Because in order to have a balance of payments balanced, you need basically to export the money again, which you have been importing through your trade surplus. And this is also the reason why Germany is also the world champion when it comes to bilateral investment treaties. We have more than 130 in place, because as the world champion in exporting capital, of course, we had an abundant interest in protecting these investments abroad. So this is it's all connected, basically, as you can see. So you need this to pay off international debts or to influence domestic exchange rates in case you have a trade deficit, for example, but you want to uphold your exchange rate. You need to have currency reserves in order to pay against the outflow, or to pay basically the outflow of capital. If you are the issuing state of an international reserve currency, in particular the United States, you can invest abroad in your own currency. You can take on money, you can take on credit from international financial markets in your own currency. So the United States is practically only indebted in US dollar. Why is this an advantage? Because in principle, the US government would not be able to default in US dollar. The strange situation in the US is that they have a legal debt ceiling, and this limits their capacity to lend on financial markets. But if they didn't have that, and if they would be able to change their monetary constitution and make the Fed dependent, for example, then they could always find ways to print enough US dollar to pay off all government bonds. Okay, so indebtedness. Think of Japan, for example. The overall debt burden of Japan is something like 200 and I don't know how many % of their GDP, which is well beyond what is normally considered to be sustainable. But still, they can lend on financial markets because the monetary constitution is designed in a way that basically large investors in Japan are more or less legally bound to invest in Japanese government bonds. By this, you can sort of recirculate your government debt and blow it up to almost no limits. This is not possible if you are lending, if your debt is in foreign currency. So the Argentine example, if you borrow in US dollars, you must pay back in US dollars, and you have no control whatsoever to generate the US dollars, except for engaging in international trade and attracting foreign investment, which brings the dollar into your foreign reserve assets. If you're not able to do that, then you will default on your international debt. The same was true, or the same is basically true for all Euro area countries, including Germany in theory. Euro area countries have no own currency anymore. They have the euro as a common currency, but legally for the member states of the euro area, the euro is a foreign currency because we cannot unilaterally change the monetary constitution anymore as an individual member state in order to make sure that we don't default in our own currency. Okay, the only way to do that would be to leave the European Union, as the United Kingdom did, but the United Kingdom wasn't part of the euro area anyway. But if you leave the European Union, then of course you're not bound by its monetary law anymore. You can reintroduce a new currency, determine that all bonds held in euro can be paid in new Deutschmark or whatever you call it, and then you can produce these new Deutschmarks without limits in theory. You will of course lose all the trust of financial markets in your economy, etc., and your fiscal situation. But legally, you can normally not default in your own currency, but you can default in a foreign currency. Okay. For the US, there is some other advantages and things associated with the problem, which is, for example, they have no cross-default clauses in their government bonds, which means if they don't pay on one line of government bonds, that doesn't mean that all the others are called in. But that's a specific problem of government lending. The disadvantage, I'm not so sure whether the US consider that as a disadvantage. You may acquire a really large balance of payment deficits. So the balance of payment situation of the United States for the past 20 years would not have been sustainable if it wasn't for the global reserve currency role of the US dollar. Because they have a deficit vis-a-vis China of, I don't know, 3-digit billion US dollars a year, and that for many years already. So basically the US is indebted to the world more and more by year, but in its own currency. Okay, and which means that in theory they won't be defaulting. In practice, they may still, due to these strange arrangements with their debt ceiling, or that international financial markets at some point lose their trust in the US economic and fiscal policy, despite their global reserve currency role. And that is basically the sort of nuclear Armageddon moment of the international financial system. Some economists scare that may be sort of visible in the future already. When we see an end of the role of the US dollar in the international financial system, this will be global economic crisis 10 times possibly. Okay, so in terms of what it economically means if the US dollar loses its role and the US government loses its capacity to lend in its own currency, there would be an extremely bumpy road ahead of us then. And, so reserve currencies are held by central banks usually, sometimes also by governments. That's why is it the same? Okay, the cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies, that is not really currencies in technical terms. Cryptocurrencies are assets which are accepted in a given circle of investors or traders, which sometimes can exchange against real currencies, such as the US dollar. So you can exchange Bitcoin against dollar, but they are not backed by anything. They get basically they derive their function from the trust which the community which it uses has in it, on the basis of the scarcity of the asset due to technological constraints. Okay, so Bitcoins, for example, the algorithm basically limits the amount of possible Bitcoins to a certain ceiling, which cannot be exceeded. And people that also believe in private currencies think this is better than having a central bank that manages the monetary base. And of course, it's also widely used in money laundering, financing criminal activities, etc. And only very few of these currencies are actually used to make payments with it. So for most who hold Bitcoins, other cryptocurrencies, that's usually an investment. And of course, the fluctuations in the exchange rate between these, for example, Bitcoins and real currencies are much more volatile than the price, sort of the price curve of the normal inflation rate is vis-a-vis real goods that you can buy with the currency. Okay. What difficulties do we have since we have no universal currency? Moving capital and payments across borders is, of course, not easy. And we need to find a mechanism, or to have a mechanism to exchange the currencies between two regimes. The country then also have to make a choice when it comes to its exchange rate regimes. So the system by which we decide the price of our own currency in foreign currencies. Okay, so we can go for a fixed price, for example, a fixed exchange rate, and say, yes, the euro can only be bought with 1.5 US dollars, for example. That's our fixed exchange rate. And then we see whether financial markets apply that, or whether they consider that to be the wrong price. And then we see a decline in transactions actually taking place, etc. But having a fixed exchange rate is difficult to manage for almost all countries, I would say. A freely floating exchange rate would mean we leave it to the markets to decide on the basically supply and demand, and with no intervention by the central bank, which has the advantage of the exchange rate becoming an indicator for economic development, for whether you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit, whether the international financial markets have trust in your economy or not, whether you see capital inflows or outflows, etc. That is all then reflected in the exchange rate, which is why the exchange rate is very often of high political relevance to governments. The smaller the country, one may say, the more important maybe the exchange rate for the country, in particular against the US dollar, may be. And what is also a problem is the provision of international liquidity. Consider the case of Argentina, with its debt crisis it had due to having basically a full dollarization through a currency board, originally with a one-on-one exchange rate for the Argentine peso against the US dollar, lending heavily in US dollars, borrowing heavily in US dollars, and then defaulting in US dollars. If you have a country which is indebted in a foreign currency, and this creates problems for the international financial system, you need to provide liquidity to this country. And the liquidity can only be provided through international de facto reserve currencies, because only those are freely convertible into the currency you need. In the case of Argentina, they needed US dollars to pay off their debt, to pay off their creditors. So what you needed to give them was US dollars, which means providing international liquidity means you need to have other currencies, and which is again then under the control of other governments, other states. An international currency would be under the control of, for example, an international organization, but other currencies are not. The IMF has solved that problem to some extent with the special drawing rights, which is kind of basket of currencies. but then still you are subject, of course, to the conditionality of the IMF, etc. So having your own currency and having all these different currency brings about the problem of international liquidity. Moving to convertibility, there's two types, one being free movement of capital, so convertibility for capital transactions, and free movement of payments for international trade in goods and services. The latter, the free movement for payments for international trade in goods and services, that's a requirement of IMF membership, and basically it's also an indirect requirement of being a GATT contracting party, because when you are part of the international economic system, you must guarantee the free flow of goods and services to the extent that you have made specific commitments, and you must not impair that by limiting the conversion of currencies made for the payment of the goods that are to be traded freely. Okay, for free movement of capital, we don't have that. We only have that in the OECD, in the Code on Invisible Transactions. We have that in the European Union with the Maastricht Treaty arrangements. And we may see that in some bilateral agreements as well, but internationally, multilaterally, we don't have free movement of capital. And not only free movement of like direct investment, but also no free movement of portfolio investment related capital transactions. And up until the mid-1990s, I would say, there was a political push towards free movement of capital, at least in the Western industrialized world. So in the OECD, also to some extent in the IMF. In the EU, we have that in the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which means at this time there was a widely held belief in industrialized Western democracies that free movement of capital should be the rule. But at least, or at the minimum, by the end of the 1990s, with the Asian crisis, the Russian crisis, and all the other currency crises, possibly realization kicked in that it is not made for all economies in the world. So you need to have a certain level of maturity as an economy in order to be able to deal with free movement of capital. And in particular, in countries with no stable democracy, maybe countries in transition from a central planned economy to a market economy, or other sort of risk factors, for example, heavily dependent on export income from crude oil or gas, which was the reason for the Russian crisis, because Russia is heavily dependent on the export of natural gas and crude oil. And when the price for crude oil plummeted in the 1990s, that basically cut by half the income of the Russian government, which basically triggered the fall of the government and then the coming in of Vladimir Putin also, because Russia was so dependent on this. And if you're in such a situation, free movement of capital may not be the best scenario for you, but it may be better to have limitations on that too. Let's see. The exchange rate. Mentioned already quite some often in that presentation. What is the exchange rate? Exactly, it's the external value of a currency, and the system expresses the price for the currency, for one currency in another currency, in terms of another. Which means that if you have a freely floating currency, there is no price management. The banks will tell you the actual price for the US dollar in euro, for the real in US dollar, for the real in euro, and vice versa. That's just sort of a price that can be expressed two ways, which is the difference between real prices, because of course you will never go to a car dealer and ask him what the price for your real is in Mercedes S-Class. And he would say something like, yes, well, you will, well, 1 real is something like a screw of our S-Class or something. That would be like the price expressed the other way. For exchange rates, we always have both prices. And you need to look careful into which relationship is expressed, and in order to get the real picture. For some currencies, of course, this is a lot easier. for the euro and the US dollar, this is always complicated because they are almost at parity, but not exactly. So if you see something like 0.93 is the price, then you know that this is currently, you must know that this is a price in euro for $1, because at the moment the euro is higher than the US dollar, but it may be the other way around pretty soon again. So this is the way in which you need to look at this. Basically, you can have two systems, fixed rates or floating rates. In the IMF, as I said, prior to 1978, legally prior to 1971, de facto, you had fixed rates. And after that, we have seen floating rates basically all over the Western industrialized world, as it is so difficult to uphold an exchange rate peg, fixed rate, in particular, if your currency is under downward pressure. So which policy options do you have? Free floating means you don't do anything about the exchange rate. That's our policy in the European Union, for example, vis-a-vis third currencies. Pegging means you peg against another currency. A crawling peg means you peg against another currency, but you have like a price road ahead of you, which means you will adapt and change the price following a pre-given path in order to accommodate for different inflation rates in your country and the country where you have the currency against which you have pegged. For example, if you expect the inflation rate in the United States to be 5% and your own currency, your own inflation rate to be 10% a year, for whatever reasons, then you will need to devaluate against the US dollar by 5% every year, okay, in order to be able to keep the exchange rate fixed. Otherwise, you would see basically a deflation in US dollar prices in your country, which is not sustainable for your currency peg. A currency board, that is the farthest way you can go towards giving up your own currency, basically. You issue a domestic currency, but you back it fully with a foreign currency. Typically the US dollar or maybe the euro, backing in the sense of 100% backed. So when your monetary base is 5 trillion whatever, then you will need 5 trillion US dollar for full backing that guarantees exchanging the domestic currency into US dollar at any point in time. So you have an entirely fixed exchange rate of 1-on-1, no crawling, no flexibility whatsoever. That's what Argentina basically did with the US dollar. But this is not sustainable if you are not having the same economic development path and inflation as the country of the currency against which you have pegged, for which you have used as backing your own currency. And if your own inflation is something like 10 or 15%, and the one in the US is only 5% or 2%, that means that life becomes unaffordable for your population pretty soon, because in US dollar, this is just not payable, okay? So you need to sort of accommodate for this, and therefore a currency board is only a recommendation for a small economy, which is highly integrated with the larger economy, which is typically neighboring. There you can do that, but then you could also go for a full currency union or just adopt the currency of the other country and give up your monetary sovereignty entirely. That would be something for Andorra in Europe, for San Marino, for Monaco, and none of these countries still have their own currencies with a currency board. A currency board for a large economy, it's extremely difficult to manage and to uphold and to finance. But again, the policy options usually chosen in order to import the credibility of the monetary institution of the other country. So you want to, in order to basically giving up control over your monetary base, you must be following the monetary policy of the other country. this may be an option if you have lost all trust of your own population in your own economic capacity and capability to manage a monetary system. Then a currency board may be the right choice. And just say we are basically the United States in small. We follow what the Fed does, and you are guaranteed that prices will more or less fall in line with the price development in the United States. So in a hyperinflation constellation, this may be a good thing, because otherwise you won't break the circle of hyperinflation. Maybe for some Central African states or so, this may be an option to go for a full currency board, at least for some time. But then it must really work, because if you can't control inflation, then the currency board will break up because it's too expensive to uphold. Or you go for a full dollarization or euroization in case it is a euro, which means the dollar replaces your domestic currency. You can do that by political choice. You basically, that the currency board would be a kind of an intermediate situation. You would start with the currency board and would say, okay, now we back all our domestic currency with US dollar in order to stop inflation. And once you have succeeded, you say, and now we exchange all circulating domestic currency into US dollar, and we are fully dollarized, and we make no monetary policy of our own anymore. That's a way you can do that unilaterally without any sort of international agreement. That's not necessary. But the problem then will be that your domestic banks have no access to central bank financing in the US, for example. And we have full euroization in the European Union for the mentioned states, Andorra, San Marino, Vatican City, and Monaco. But this is on the basis of an international agreement between the European Union and the respective state that includes also, for example, access to central bank financing and payment systems in the euro area and the like. So that is the problems you're confronted with if you go for dollarization. You're basically part of the monetary sphere of the United States, and your economy will have to live with that. And that's particularly problematic for financial institutions. So, for example, what if a bank in your country defaults in a full dollarization situation? You would have to recapitalize it in US dollars, but you cannot produce the US dollars yourself. You want to need to have them in your public budget. And so the whole system becomes really difficult and tough. But that's also the reason why the credibility is so high, because you're really giving up your power over your money, and the money which is then in circulation is much more credible than your own money was before. And some countries privately dollarize, which means that at least for high value transactions, people don't use the domestic currency anymore. There was a case, for example, with Turkey for quite some time. I don't know for which other countries, and I don't want to blame anybody for that, because if you have high inflation for like everyday goods, these are still paid in domestic currency. But as soon as you get to, for example, real estate transactions, the seller will ask for US dollar, euro, Swiss franc, whatever. I don't know to what extent this may be a phenomenon also in Brazil, that you can buy really precious goods only with international currencies and not with the domestic currency. So that would be, but not a legal dollarization, but a factual dollarization. And of course, if hyperinflation becomes really bad, then the population in the country may not use the currency at all anymore. Okay, and they will diverge to whatever they have, cigarettes. They will go back to barter trade. They will use international currencies. And I mean, as a German, I know that because we have gone through all that after World War II. I mean, we have seen our monetary system break down twice in the last century, and that's why Germans are considered to be so kind of hyper interested in inflation and type of hypersensitive, you may say. Or you go have a currency union, like the European Currency Union, or Economic and Monetary Union, as we call it also, where you pool the monetary sovereignty, you establish a supranational institution which is tasked with the monetary policy, with the exchange rate policy, etc., etc. And that means we have more than one country, at least two, which share the same currency, but this is not the national currency of either state. So we introduce a new currency which is separate from the currencies of the participating states. We replace the currencies of the participating states with this new currency and let it be managed by an external, supranational, or international organization. Okay, and that's the fullest you can go with sort of giving up on your own monetary sovereignty. Either have full dollarization, which is difficult to unwind, of course, or have a full currency union, which creates similar problems in its own right than with the economic path of development in the different participating states. If we move on to free movement of capital, capital movement entails foreign direct investment as well as cross-border real estate purchases, as well as securities investments, loan grants, other operations with financial institutions. So capital movement is typically characterized by the establishment of a cross-border ownership relationship or an asset holder relationship. So we have the asset holder in one jurisdiction and the asset in the other. Whereas a trade transaction is characterized by goods going that way, payment is going that way, but afterwards there is no legal relationship anymore between the seller and the buyer. Once the trade is concluded, it's over. But if you buy an asset in another jurisdiction and you remain seated in your jurisdiction, you have a cross-border property relationship, basically. And all these constellations create that sort of relationship. That helps in risk diversification. If you go abroad and you invest in different jurisdictions, of course, you are less dependent on the economic development in a particular sector. Opening up for free movement of capital is problematic if you have a weak financial sector. We have seen that, for example, in the Asian crisis, you may see an inflow of capital in US dollar that's being then invested, for example, in your stock market. So you have a stock market boom because somebody believes that Indonesia, the Philippines, whatever country in Southeast Asia is on a very good economic growth path. So asset prices surge in domestic currency. So you have moved, let's say, $1 billion into the country, and you have invested $1 billion in the Philippine stock market. And then the Philippine stock market triples its prices, okay? And you sell before the market collapses, which means the $1 billion that have been flowing in are sold at the value of $3 billion if the exchange rate hasn't changed. So you sell your assets again, and you want to take out or want to exchange that back into US dollar in order to repatriate $3 billion. That's a problem for the central bank, because when they got your $1 billion as foreign reserves, that hasn't tripled whilst your domestically exchanged currency and stock market tripled. Okay, so basically the foreign reserves are lacking $2 billion in order to pay you out in the currency you've brought into the country. But if you have free movement of capital for portfolio investment, you are basically under an obligation to exercise these transactions. And that's what happened in the Asian crisis in particular. You saw asset price bubbles in domestic currencies, also basically fueled by foreign investors that had been trying to ride the wave and earn the money and then go out. And the usual reaction to that will be that you introduce capital restrictions again on the export of capital, so that you basically kind of bail in the investor and he can't get out with its US dollars, because otherwise you would be running out of foreign reserve assets. And that would again raise the problem of international liquidity. And that's why portfolio investment, free movement of portfolio investment is problematic if you are a small country, if your financial markets are not mature really, if you have maybe also governance problems when it comes to financial governance of institutions, supervision problems, where you have authorities who just don't see the problem, etc. That's the problems that come with free movement of capital for portfolio investments. For foreign direct investments, that's not that much of a problem, because then you have investors who want to invest in the country for a longer time, want entrepreneurial control, and all this sort of things. But investment just for stock market boom riding is not a good thing to happen for you. Overall, the movement has been towards freer flow of capital, but it's not as quick as it was up to the 1990s, I would say, in particular after the global economic crisis in 2007 and onwards. The euphoria about free movement of capital in the world is rather limited, and now we see entirely new restrictions, even in industrialized countries, on, for example, investment screening, outbound investment screening, and the like. So we rather see less liberal international economic transactions than we did see 20 years ago. International liquidity, I already mentioned that this is needed, international reserve assets, to meet balance of payments needs. So in order to be able to pay the transactions of your private undertakings, imports in particular, you need to be able to provide an international reserve currency, a de facto international currency. You need it also as a central bank in order to influence the exchange rate. Figure again the situation: you have a booming stock market, you have a fixed exchange rate, you had inflow of US dollar, which you have just absorbed by your foreign currency reserves, and therefore you had no upward pressure on your currency. But then when you have the outflow, you get the downward pressure, and that you can only fight with the foreign currency reserves you have. And when you run out of that, you either have to impose capital restrictions to undo your currency peg and devaluate your currency, which would be, for example, in the example with Philippines, which I mentioned, you could, if you think that the Philippines maybe had a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar, 1 billion goes in, it triples in value in domestic currency, so the investor wants 3 billion to take out in US dollar. You can avoid that by either imposing capital restrictions and say, no US dollar exports anymore, or you can break up your currency peg and say, yeah, look, but we have changed our exchange rate now from 1 to 1 on 3 to 1, which means you bring your 3 trillion US dollar worth of local currency, but you only get 1 billion US dollar in return. So basically what you had when you came in the first place. So we basically kind of match and accommodate the stock market boom through a devaluation in the currency, so that in terms of US dollar, the stock market still keeps its original value. That's a sort of policies with which you can try to find the drying up of your foreign currency reserves. That I think we can jump for the sake of time. So what is the impossible balance that you need to strike? And if I recall correctly, that is also my last slide then. The impossible balance, or the trilemma of international monetary policies for a country when deciding, for example, to enter a currency union. There's 3 things of which you can only achieve 2 at the same time. And you will always have to give up on one. And the 3 things are stable exchange rates, so a fixed system. If you want to have stable exchange rates, for example, because it is good for trade, because it is foreseeable for traders, and that's basically what we had until 1971, and what we have within the European Union, within the euro area. If you want that, you either can maintain monetary independence, so an independent monetary policy focusing on domestic economic objectives, but then you can't have free movement of capital. Or you want stable exchange rates and free movement of capital. That means you must devote your monetary policy entirely to upholding the fixed exchange rate. Okay, which means, for example, that when your currency gets under pressure, devaluation pressure, you need to increase the interest rate in your country in order to attract foreign capital again. Okay, because the downward pressure on your currency stems from an outflow of capital in relation to the inflow. So we have excessive outflows. How can you fight that? By increasing the interest rate. But the thing is that an increased interest rate may not be in the interest of your domestic economy, because in domestic economy, if it is not in a real boom phase, will have difficulties to cope with the increased interest rate. Okay, so you have to give up on one. Okay, and the solution, or what we see in the Western industrialized world, is normally the combination of monetary independence plus free movement of capital, no fixed exchange rates. That's basically the G7 arrangement among the participating industrialized countries. The arrangement for within the European Union is basically the combination of stable exchange rates, because we have replaced all the currencies with the euro, and maintaining monetary independence, for the internal, and enable free movement of capital between the euro area member states. But all participating member states have given up their monetary policy independence entirely. We have no monetary policy for Italy, Germany, France, etc. anymore. We have one set of monetary policy that applies to all 19 member states that participate in the common currency. Okay, so in the European Union internally, we have basically waived our monetary independence as participating member states. Externally, the euro area is again within the G7 sort of consensus. We have free movement of capital vis-a-vis third countries, and we have monetary independence, which means the European Central Bank only targets domestic economic figures and price levels, etc., but doesn't look at the exchange rate, at least not as an original objective. And we have free movement, so we have no fixed exchange rates. But of course, there's other solutions in the world. China, for example, has a more or less stable exchange rate. They have a kind of crawling peg against the basket of currencies. Nobody really knows what it is and how exactly it is combined. And they have monetary policy independence for their domestic objectives, but they have no free movement of capital. Okay, so that's like the triangle in which you have to make your choices. And if you go for a currency union, that will mean giving up monetary independence, getting stable exchange rates, and free movement of capital within the currency union in return. But this is only under the optimal currency area theory. This does only work if the economies of the countries concerned are sufficiently interlinked, are sufficiently in the same sort of economic flux, so that there is no need for great disparities in the monetary policy. If you have one country in a recession, whereas the other one is in a boom, you will have difficulties as a central bank to manage that within a currency union. And I guess I've spoken for enough time now. It's almost 100 minutes now. And I have a lecture in about half an hour time myself again. So I stop here. I thank you very much for your attention. That's the picture of two books which may be of interest to you. The readings for this class, the one on the right-hand side. That's a rather small one here, like 100 pages roughly. And the other one is something I edited with a colleague on the EU law of economic and monetary union, which has also chapters on all the economics background and the international law background and all those sort of things. But that's roughly like 1,600 pages or so, maybe not really the reading for your class, at least not if your teacher wants to get alive out of the classroom after having dropped the readings on you. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I still have something like 15 to 20 minutes to stay with you, but then I will need to run for my next class. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Christoph, for your brilliant lecture on much more than some fundamentals of monetary law. I think you presented us a really interesting, very complex and interesting picture of the main legal problems we are facing nowadays at this international system. We have one question from our audience, and I could also make a very short one. It's actually just a remark. Do you think that these problems we're facing with new monetary arrangements, with a more questioned role of the IMF in this international picture, does it reflect in a more troublesome way of acting of the International Monetary Fund? Do you think its governance structure can deliver what it promises? I recently read a paper that said that the IMF should go through a soul-searching process, should find new ways of being helpful and effective. Although it can act as a lender of last resort, really indebted countries are facing difficulties in restructuring processes with China, with India, with Saudi Arabia, or private creditors. Do you think the IMF can still be a helpful and useful international institution at this scenario that you presented us? And then our student Gabriel, who's also called Gabriel, has another question. But anyway, do you want me to present the other question, or do you
No,
want
I
to...
think I would rather answer the first
Okay.
to the extent I'm able to do that. Also first, because remembering two questions, I'm too old for that. Well, to what extent can the IMF play a useful role in the future? That's a very difficult question, and that is a question that is, in a way, also applicable to all other international institutions that we know of the post-World War II international legal order. I mean, we see similar questions with regard to the WTO, and also with the United Nations now, with Russia's war against Ukraine and the prohibition on the use of force. The particular problem with the IMF, of course, is that it is an international institution which does not follow the rule one country, one vote, but uses weighted voting, as you know, of course, which means that the United States still holds something like, I think, 16% of the capital of the IMF. And with that, have a blocking minority for very fundamental restructuring decisions regarding the IMF, because for that you need 85% of the capital vote. So basically, the IMF is not an entirely US-dominated organization. I wouldn't go that far. And of course, the US are not an entirely kind of I mean, they are not abusing the IMF to their needs, I would say. So they basically, power brings responsibility. And for many decades, of course, this responsibility has also been used in a responsible way, which is necessary. But of course, we have increasing doubts as to the possibility to further do that in light of the increased relevance of China and the limited role China can play in the IMF due to the constant conflict with the US. So what we see is that more and more countries kind of not really turn away from the IMF, but maybe end their kind of marriage in the sense of monogamy with the IMF, and also go for other institutions that provide kind of similar public goods, such as the Asian Development Bank. I think it's a name. That was set up by under Chinese influence, or become part of the Belt and Road Initiative and the lending which is available there. But then also you can already see that going the Chinese way, turning away from the US and go to the Chinese as your home banker, doesn't make you freer. It brings separate problems, and the Chinese are certainly not less demanding in the long run when it comes to questions like political alliances, loyalty, and the like, than the US have been over the past decades. So, I mean, structurally, the IMF certainly is capable of adapting and supporting the countries in need. And I mean, we have seen new inventions anyway over the global economic crisis, the enhanced capacity to lend, and the new instruments that were set up. And also, my impression sometimes is that it's a bit with a doctor who's consulted by a person that has been smoking, drinking, not doing sports, and eating a lot too much over 40 years, and then has heart problems. And then the doctor says something like, yeah, maybe stop smoking, stop drinking, engage in light sports, and maybe your diet is also a kind of a problem. And then the person is unhappy with the doctor. And that is basically a bit of a problem with IMF conditionality. I mean, IMF conditionality has not always been perfect. It has not always been tailor-made to the countries they were asked, has maybe not been sensitive enough to domestic political constraints and so forth. But at the end of the day, if your economic problem is that you are spending more than you earn, so you can do that something about that, except for yourself, by cutting down your spending behavior. And for that, I think still that the IMF can play a useful role. And I would have no idea right now how to replace it. And that's the same with the WTO, and it's the same with the United Nations. We are kind of stuck with the institutions we have, and it's extremely difficult to change them. And therefore, we need to find ways in which to make the best out of the existing system and use it and reform it in the best possible ways. But that, of course, also requires that all participants, all actors in the system act responsible, not only to their self-interest and so forth. And what I think the European Union always tries to claim, at least, and is that we are the sort of the not impartial broker, but that based on our own history of integration, we know ways how to sort of find compromises between countries that have different interests, different problems, and the like. But I know it doesn't really answer your question.
No, it does. It's exactly what I wanted to hear, actually.
So what's the next question?
So let's see, Andressa and Stefan or Conti, do you have questions or remarks? Our student Gabriel is asking when you're going to translate to English your Währungshoheit book. See, your works are well known here.
Unfortunately, not. There was my Habilitation, and I would first have to heavily update that, because there was written and submitted. Basically, I submitted that to the Faculty of Law in Munich in October 2008. So there was basically just when the global economic crisis and the subprime mortgage crisis hit for the first time, and then it was accepted and reviewed and everything, and it was published in German then in 2010, just 1 year later, due to a general scholarship that I received for the publication. And I also had to accommodate for the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon, which happened on the 1st of December 2009. So I made all these slight changes and updates, but after that, it has been on the bookshelf and basically never been touched again. No, that's not entirely true, but I mean, there's never been the project of translating that into English, and I don't know whether there would be really a market for that. I mean, English publishers are a kind of special breed of their own, I would say, and there would be possibly demands to sort of commercialize the substance a bit to make it better sellable and all this kind of stuff. And with the edited volume on the EU Law of Economic and Monetary Union, together with my friend Fabian Amtenbrink, I kind of felt that I've done my service to the monetary community already, and I'm focusing a lot more on trade in recent times, because doing international trade law and monetary law side by side at a certain level was almost impossible. I mean, in terms of time resources, we have to teach very broadly in Germany, also including German public law, general EU law, and so forth. And it's time-wise for me as a father of 2 kids, it's impossible to stay engaged at the same level of intensity with international monetary law. So at some point, I had to make a decision between monetary law and trade law, and I opted more or less, not really voluntarily, but for some other reasons, it fell for trade law, and therefore I've not been doing that much monetary law anymore. But the fundamentals, of course, have not changed that much, so I can still talk about the fundamentals.
Very well. Christoph, I think we are running out of time. So we have another question from Gabriel, but I think I should write it to you when.
No, that's okay. I mean, I've 10 minutes left. The lecture is in the same building, and I've all prepared it, so that's no problem.
Okay, so he asked if you think that the quantitative easing is the same as printing money from the legal perspective. He mentions Bernanke, that QE has not directly affected money supply, and as a result, banks still keep the final decisions.
Mhm.
If they
Yeah, I see it. Yeah, it's visible on the screen. Well, that quantitative easing has no effect on money supply, I think, is not true, because I mean, quantitative easing means, for example, you are broadening the basis of what you accept as collateral for central bank lending. Okay, I mean, up until the global economic crisis in Europe, for example, central banks have only entertained limited tendering. So they offered a certain amount of central bank money for a period of, let's say, 3 months. And banks made a bid at which interest rate they would be willing to take that. And then with the global economic crisis, the non-standard monetary policy measures, as we call that in the European Union, were invented. And they included, for example, long-term lending, long-term targeted refinancing operations, and all this sort of stuff. And none of these were limited in terms of the amount the banks could get. So what was limiting the capability of banks to lend central bank money, which then feeds into the creation of commercial bank money, was the collateral banks could provide in order to get the money from the central bank. Because in order to get central bank money, you need to provide collateral. And the ECB and all central banks have a huge manual on what they accept, how they downrate on the basis of ratings of credit agencies, and etc., etc. And quantitative easing has meant that the requirements for collateral have been relaxed dramatically in terms of the necessary rating, the kinds of collateral, etc. And by that, of course, the monetary basis has been expanded hugely, and you can see that in the balance sheets of all the big central banks in the world, that M1 or even M0, so the monetary base has expanded. The interesting effect is that M3, so what is usually being used in monetary aggregate 3, what is being used as the sort of the actual subject of interest when making forecasting about inflation and the like, hasn't dramatically increased. So central bank money has basically replaced lending by banks. So quantitative easing has expanded the monetary base, but still it is not the same as printing money. And even the non-standard measures such as the public sector purchase program, the OMT program, and whatever is being done in buying government bonds on the secondary markets is not the same as printing money, I believe, because in order to print, or printing money would mean we buy the government bonds on the primary markets. Even if there is no buyers on the financial markets, we would, as central banks, buy it and then expand the monetary basis directly. When a private sector participant in the capital markets is the first bidder in a tender procedure for government bonds, then the money must already be in the market, okay? And with the criteria that the ECB, for example, uses for secondary market purchases, there is no guarantees for investors that that the bonds they have bought from the government will be passed on. It's the so-called passing on of bonds, which was seen very critical But for that, you would need a guarantee, and you would, of course, need that the central bank pays you more than you have been paying, have been lending to the government. If you get less, then you have lost money, and that's not the purpose of financial market participants. So there is many sort of conditions that must be applied, that must exist in order to really call quantitative easing as being equivalent to printing money. And I think these conditions were not fulfilled. And the problem is less the buying of government bonds on the secondary market, and rather the easing of the collateral conditions, which made it possible to expand the monetary base.
Thank you very much, Professor Herrmann. I think next time, if you want to visit Brazil, you will sure be invited to know our university, the University of São Paulo. You've delivered a very interesting lecture on a topic that is still a very relevant one. And I thank you. I wholeheartedly thank you for being here with us and sharing your time with our course. Professor
Thank you
Conte.
very much for the attendance, and it will be a pleasure. I've never been to Brazil so far, and after the World Cup, I was scared. I must not, as a German, as you know. But a good colleague and friend of mine is in charge of managing our Brazilian partner universities, and I know that we have a very active exchange programs with Brazilian universities, and basically every semester I have Brazilian students in my classes that are taught in English, like the one next, which is the Law of Regional Economic Integration, to which I have to run now. So thank you very much, and have a good day in Brazil. And Gabriel, we stay in contact, I would suggest. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Estamos um pouco atrasados para a leitura dos artigos, né?